Our second reading comes from Exodus 36, continuing on with the story. Then Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab, and every gifted artisan in whose heart the Lord had put wisdom, everyone whose heart was stirred, to come and do the work. And they received from Moses all the offering which the children of Israel had brought for the work of the service of making the sanctuary. So they continued bringing to him freewill offerings every morning. Then all the craftsmen who were doing all the work of the sanctuary came, each from the work he was doing, and they spoke to Moses, saying, "The people bring much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord has commanded us to do." So Moses gave a commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, "Let neither man nor woman do any more work for the offering of the sanctuary." And the people were restrained from bringing, for the material they had was sufficient for all the work to be done. Indeed, too much. This is the word of the Lord, friends. Thanks be to God. I'll never forget riding and hiking through the Sinai wilderness, the desert that lies just between Egypt and Israel. The Sinai wilderness is a barren wasteland covered with jagged orange and red rocks as far as the eye can see. The farther you get into the Sinai, the bigger the mountains get. The Sinai is also a world of extremes. If you're not careful hiking in the Sinai, you'll die of thirst or heat exhaustion during the day, and you will freeze to death at night. On one intense day of hiking, I remember feeling particularly exhausted, drenched in sweat, smelling to high heaven. The whole group of us were on our last leg. We did not have any fuel left in the tank. As we hiked around a bend, feeling as though this walking tour would never end, we came to a large tent, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. Our leaders spoke no words of instruction to us. Instead, a group of Bedouin, men and women who live in the wilderness, motioned us to come and sit. One young boy came up and helped me take off my pack. Without a moment's notice, our water jugs were being filled by young children. Beautiful carpets were laid underneath the shade of that old beaten tent. As I sat down, I saw before me a huge table of fresh food as long and as wide as this communion table. A young girl spoke to me in Arabic and motioned for me to begin eating. We sat there for hours, far away from cell phone service, telling jokes and laughing in the middle of the wilderness, enjoying a feast prepared for us by a group of Muslim men and women who did not speak our language, didn't worship the same God, had never heard of Holland, Michigan, where I am from, and who had never met me before. No matter how much we ate and drank, the Bedouin families kept coming back with more pita, more falafel, more water. There was much, much more than enough food to go around. I was 19 that day, and that meal will forever be burned into my memory. I remember asking one of my leaders, why did these people do this for us? Why did they make this food for me? I don't understand. He said, "Josh, that was more food than they eat an entire month. Some of them may have given up eating privileges just so you could have this meal." That generosity, that's just who they are. Well, in that same brutal wilderness, worlds far away from Salisbury, North Carolina, is where most of the book of Exodus and our story for today took place. Many of us are probably familiar with the greatest hits of the book of Exodus. There's Egypt and the tyrannical Pharaoh, there's Moses, there's the Red Sea that gets split in two, and most famously, the Ten Commandments given from atop Mount Sinai. But after the Ten Commandments comes a section of the Bible most of us have not read. It's what I would like to call a skimming section. You see, while the first half of the book of Exodus is filled with intrigue, murder, miracles, hail falling from the sky, voices coming out of burning bushes, the stuff that makes for good television, the second half of the book recounts with relentless precision and detail the ins and outs of the construction of a huge desert tent known as the tabernacle. See, in other words, the first half of Exodus is like watching a good action film. And the second half is like reading a 15-chapter-long construction blueprint. Now, if you heard the scripture read aloud today and you wondered where the heck the preacher was taking you today, you are not alone. Some Jewish interpreters reading this text have wondered why in the Bible it takes 2 chapters to describe God creating the heavens and the earth, but 15 chapters to tell the story of human beings making a tent in the middle of nowhere. The operative question of the rabbis being, why spend so much time talking about the building of a tent? Even more curious to me, though, is that for 430 years, that's 10 generations, the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt. Their slave labor? Building temples with their hands and pyramids that would pay homage to the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, and the foreign gods of Egypt. For 430 years, their hands were bloodied and blistered by the bricks and mortar they produced, erecting towers to pagan gods they did not believe in. I imagine a young Hebrew slave child asking her parent, "Mama, why do we build? Will it ever stop?" She answers, "We build because we have to. But one day we will be free." So here we sit with God's Hebrew people, worn by the desert heat, thirsty from constant walking, brittle and beaten up from the memories of Pharaoh's building projects. And what does God say to us? Hey, y'all, let's get to building. You understand the moment, right? Imagine what the people thought as they heard God's request. Another building? Was this God any different than Pharaoh? Is this God any different than the gods of Egypt? Are we still enslaved here in the wilderness as we were before? But much to the surprise of the people, this God will not leave them to do the work alone. This God is going to get his hands dirty and work alongside the people. For as the text says, the Spirit of God has filled 2 men, Bezalel and Aholiab, 2 people with wisdom, skill, and heart, filled and inspired them to lead the building campaign. Now, the subtle suggestion here is that God is taking the building skills that parents had passed down for generations as slaves in Egypt. Right? God doesn't wait until the people are out of the pain of their past in order to give them a new future. He doesn't hold off until they're out of this period of transition and change. And instead, God meets them where they are, takes the building skills they have acquired that were used for destruction and death, and uses them as skills to build a new future of possibility and hope. Like an artist, like a brick mason, like a construction foreman, like an imaginative architect, the Spirit illumines and inspires the people of Israel to once again build together. Have you ever thought of the work of the Spirit in that way? And what do they build? They not build a shrine paying homage to the ego of the tyrannical Pharaoh, but a movable tent called the tabernacle. You may have heard that word before, tabernacle. You see, while the pharaohs were allowed only in the pyramids of Egypt and no one else, the meaning of the word tabernacle suggests a radical departure is about to take place. For tabernacle not only means to dwell, but it is also connected for the root that means to be a neighbor. What are the people building? They are building a place where God and they can become neighbors together, where they can get to know one another, where they can spend time and life together. It's not surprising then that in the Gospel of John we hear the words, "And the Word became flesh, and not only dwelt, but tabernacled amongst us." And the Word became flesh and became a neighbor. As one author says, and the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. This tabernacle will also function as an Ebenezer. If you've heard that hymn, "Come Thou Fount," you may know what an Ebenezer is. It is a physical reminder of something that God has done in the past so that we can remember what God has done. You may at one time in your life have read the list of all of the things that the people of Israel put inside of the tabernacle and wondered, what in the world are these things for? What do they mean? Here's a few of them. The lights of the lampstand remember both the pillar of fire that led Israel out of slavery and the burning bush that God first met Moses in. The bread of presence remembers the manna that God literally dropped out of thin air when the people were angry and hungry. The water basin remembers how God split the Red Sea in two. And the Ark of the Covenant, with the 10 Commandments within it, remember that God once made a covenant promise to the people that he would be with them through thick and thin, no matter what, and that he would never leave them nor forsake them. See, wherever Israel goes in the wilderness, this tent, this tabernacle, will travel with them. They will put it at the center of their camp. So when their hearts are torn with the loss of their loved ones, when their souls are tattered by the brutality of enslaved memories, when their faith is questioned and doubts and disbelief arise, they will look at that tent and remember. Mama, why do we build? Will there ever be anything else? We build to remember, because God has set us free. One of the more significant details of this building project is who is involved in the building. Several times, the text goes out of its way, like neon lights flashing for the reader, to mention that it was not just the talented, not just the experienced, not just the prominent builders whom God called to this task. It was not just the men, nor was it just the adults. No, it was all the people. All the people whose hearts were stirred. Men, women, boys, and girls. The whole community building their new future together. I think God was insightful enough to know that erecting a pretty building in the middle of the wilderness was not going to sustain the people. Anyone who has served on a mission trip or in another capacity with others knows that when you build together, you become one together. Every mission trip I have ever been on, despite the personalities involved, this has been the case. At the end of the trip, you are one unit together. I'm sure many of you have experienced this as well. This moment in time for Israel, this is the first time that they will build together as free people in the wilderness, and despite their pain, they will come out on the other side being one people, united, not divided. Now, lest you're thinking that our creative God is letting his creativity get into the way of practical considerations, this story also talks about something essential when it comes to building: fundraising. See, God asks the poor, homeless ex-slaves to pledge. God says to Moses, take an offering from the people, from all whose hearts are stirred, from all who are of willing heart. Some 13 times in one chapter, God asks all those whose hearts are stirred to give their own possessions as building materials for the tabernacle, which means these people's most sacred objects that they hold dear, the only objects they have, they're offering those, and they will become the foundation of this place where they will meet God. Just like those Bedouin that I met in that tent in the wilderness, the people of Israel, they just begin to give and give and give and give. Their giving isn't merely a tithe, and it's not a calculated percentage. In fact, the people of Israel give so generously that the workers come to Moses and tell him, Moses, the people are giving much more than enough for this building project you have us doing. Much more than enough. That phrase is a little awkward. And the point, I think, is that we are to imagine this long line of builders waiting to speak to Moses, and when each of them get up, they are so overwhelmed and surprised by the people's generosity that they sort of fumble over their words and say, Moses, the people are giving much more than enough. People are giving so generously, so imaginatively, so graciously that Moses actually turns them away and has to tell them to stop giving. Apparently, Moses wasn't an amazing fundraiser. And why do they give? They do not give just because it's the right thing to do, not just because their parents taught them to give when they were young, not even because God's commitment campaign was so inspiring in the wilderness. No, they give because they once were lost and now are found. They once were slaves and now are free. They once were alone and now they are one. They give because God has done so much, given so much for them, to them. They give because after 400 years of slavery, after the ups and downs in the wilderness journey, after all they have been through together, they are grateful for God's faithfulness. There is a hymn that Laura and I love. This hymn has been a tabernacle for both of us, a hymn of memory and hope that we have carried with us through the wilderness of change and transition and newness. A hymn we sung at our wedding, sung at our divinity school graduation, sung at my grandmother's funeral, sung at our ordination service, sung at our installation service here with all of you 10 weeks ago. Chorus might be familiar to you. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I hath needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto thee. I wonder what would happen if we looked back at all God has done for us. I invite you to do it. Think of all God has done to bring you to the seat where you now sit. Think of all you have needed. Think of all God has provided. Think of how great God's faithfulness has been. I wonder, what will the memories of God's doings in our past build in this community? What past hardships will God make into something new? What new, creative, inspiring thing will the Spirit put into our midst? What bright future will we build together, man, woman, and child, that will mark First Presbyterian as a tabernacle of hope in our community for years to come? What if, even in the wilderness, God's faithfulness stirred us to give much more than enough? What if, when the community looked at us and asked those people at First Presbyterian, why are they doing this? Why are they giving so much? The answer was, it's just who they are.